Hotspots are some of the most annoying problems that I have as a retoucher and you probably have as a photographer. We all have to deal with this, and it doesn't have to be difficult. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you a quick way of taking care of it, no matter your subject and lighting condition. Let's talk about hotspots. Hotspots are something that I think everybody has to deal with at some point in time if you're shooting portraits, whether it's in studio or on location. And it's pretty common. I mean, if you have a hard light and you're shooting for a few hours, chances are it tends to come up, and it's something you have to tackle because you can't just avoid it completely, right? And this tutorial is going to explain exactly how to tackle that quite seamlessly. It's something I think people tend to get stuck on just because they don't know how to deal with it and they make a mess of things. Let's do this. Let's start by explaining what we're going to do and then do it. First and foremost, we want to get an image that has that situation. In this instance, we're using a portrait of Sue, which she graciously allowed us to use, and I think it's a good example for what we're going to talk about, because over here on her forehead, you notice that there's some hot spots that typically arise in that area. It happens in your T-zones. It also happens under the eyes sometime, or on the bridge of the nose or the chin. Wherever it happens, the technique will help you fixing that realistically. That's the key, is realism. Let's go into the first step of the process. I would like to ensure that the skin itself is pretty clean. Like if there's any blemishes or any textural issues, I want to fix that now. So we'll add a blank layer, and we'll first start off with our healing brush layer that I like to do. So if you ever look at our full retouches section, you'll notice that I like to have a system in which I retouch. And it's really indicative of that because once I do something a certain way, everything just falls in order. Like whether it's hot spots or fixing under eyes, you go through a system of processes where we use a healing brush first and a clone brush, followed by the other methods. And this is no different. We're going to start with the healing brush, and we are going to jump straight in. The healing brush is located obviously on the toolbar here, and I'll use a regular healing brush, set to current and below, and then I'll zoom in here really quick, and simply start by removing some of these blemishes. They're very minor. The only reason I'm doing that is once we're done removing some of these blemishes and then take out the hot spots, it'll look a lot cleaner. I think it'll drive the point home a lot better as well. So I'll start by removing some of these more spots over here, and as I turn that on and off, you'll see exactly what I'm doing. Okay? Again, this is nothing major. This is actually the most minor part of the tutorial, just removing some of these distractions. I'll sample again and continue removing some of these blemishes. Now at the bottom, there's nothing here to remove, so I'm going to keep that as is because the texture is pretty flat, and I think that looks great. So Sue's pretty perfect, clearly, and so we don't need to do much work anyway. And the next part is going to be utilizing frequency separation, because I feel like this is where the tool really shines. Frequency separation, for those of you who don't know, is covered as well in its own separate tutorial, so you can check out in great lengths on what it is and how it works. But ultimately, it splits the texture from the color, so that way, in case we want to fiddle around with the colors of the image, it allows us to do so without messing up the texture. And I think that's really powerful in situations like this, where it gives us the ability to actually play around with that color and that hot spot without messing up the texture of the skin. And that's going to be really powerful. So we'll click on frequency separation action, but making sure you're not on your background, make sure you're on the top layer, which is the healing brush. Or if you're doing a retouching workflow, make sure you're at the topmost layer that's active or visible, so that make sure you're not on like a helper layer or a layer that's turned off. You want your most active top layer that's visible, okay? In this situation, your healing brush. So I'll click on the frequency separation action, the 8-bit one, just because this image is in 8-bit. And I also know this because if I go under image and mode, it tells me it's in 8-bit. But an easy shortcut is just looking at the file name. It tells you at the end, it says 8 and a star. It just means it's in 8-bit rather than 16. So I'll click on this 8-bit frequency separation action. The first thing it asks us is, what level of blur do you want? And that's just because we want to see what texture is going to be displaced, because it's going to put it back on top. And I would like to use a radius that just makes it look like it's out of focus, very barely. And in this instance, as I go around the image, I think about 2 is a good number. And I can see it before and after by clicking on the thumbnail. And it looks like there's no texture there. This is not something that you would normally use if you actually applied it. So 2 for this instance is good. Usually 2 to 3 is something where you want, but 2 as a safe bet is your best bet. Once it's finished running, you'll see a folder, as you normally do. Then we'll go straight to the brush layer. Here is where we're going to start working on the hotspot so we can minimize the effect. We'll go to our brush. We'll go to 2% flow. Clearly there's a trend. Every time I use a brush tool, it usually starts out at 2%. I think that's a thing that I'm known for, is utilizing the flow and making sure it's 2% at the beginning. Here is where the magic happens. You want to ensure that when you use the Option or Alt key, you're sampling right next to the hotspot. You're not sampling the hotspot itself, okay? Because what this is going to act like is almost a way to matte the area. It's going to matte it out, and it's going to make it a lot smoother without keeping the hotspot there, and that's key. So we'll Option, click on the area outside of the hotspot, and now as I start brushing, you'll see that the hotspot itself starts minimizing. For me, that 2% is a really key number because I like to see things slowly come in. I don't like things going too fast. And this allows me to do that. See, when I turn it on and off, that hotspot's minimized. And as I zoom out, you can still see the shape of her natural contours. You don't want to flatten it out too much, just because what tends to happen is that if you flatten out the area too much, you will get an inverse effect. You'll get a forehead that looks too flat. And if I did that to Sue, I think she would kill me. So I'm not going to do that. And it's just a means to even it out. So when you zoom out to this level, you'll notice that it's barely obvious that we did that because we're leaving a little bit there. We're leaving a little bit of that natural contour of her face, of her forehead there. But secondly, this also applies to other areas like under eyes and the side of the face, and if you want to make it more matte anywhere else, this is the place to do so. So I'm basically just sampling next to the hotspot. It doesn't really even matter as to where you sample, as long as it's close by, and you start brushing it away. And what that does is it just mattes it out like digital makeup. So if you are familiar with utilizing makeup and getting a correct brush for every single area, it's basically the same concept. And just like that, in a couple of minutes, we're able to minimize those hotspots. This also works in the hair. So if you have an area that's too bright, I can quickly sample an area next to an area that I want to tone down and do that as well. But the key is not to overdo this, because if you do, it's going to look really flat and weird. So if you overdo this, it's not a big issue. All you need to do is either use the erase tool at a low flow and just erase a little bit, or you can use a mask. like we've mentioned before in the masking section. So, you can decide what you want to do. But ultimately, this technique allows you to take care of hotspots regardless of the person, the subject, and where it's located.